Good evening. Today we're going to make a chaplet in honor of Saint Philomena. Saint Philomena was a young martyr of the church, and her chaplet has 13 red beads and 3 white beads. It has her medal at the end or at the beginning, and it's joined with a centerpiece. I chose this Madonna for the centerpiece, and I chose some small wooden red painted beads. That's in honor of her 13 years on this earth, and the white beads are in honor of her purity. This little chaplet can be found at our website. And this evening I'm going to make one live for you. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about her story. First, we're going to talk about the prayers on the chaplet. A little card will come with your chaplet, and I'll read it to you. Saint Philomena is a faithful patron for many needs, including impossible, forgotten, and desperate causes. Pope Gregory XVI named her the patroness of the living Rosary. Her chaplet consists of 3 white beads and 13 red beads. On the medal, you will say the Apostles' Creed, to ask for the grace of faith. On each of the white beads, say an Our Father in honor of the 3 divine persons of the Blessed Trinity. In thanksgiving for all favors obtained through her intercession, and in thanksgiving to the Holy Trinity for our little saint. On each of the red beads, which are 13 in number to commemorate the 13 years of her life she spent on earth, you say the following prayer. Hail, O holy Saint Philomena, whom I acknowledge after Mary as my advocate with the divine spouse. Intercede for me now and at the hour of my death. Saint Philomena, beloved daughter of Jesus and Mary, pray for us who have recourse to thee. Amen. In conclusion, so you're going to go all the way around and conclude right here in the center. Hail, O illustrious Saint Philomena, who shed so courageously your blood for Christ. I bless the Lord for all the 8 graces he has bestowed upon thee during thy life, and especially at thy death. I praise and glorify him for the honor and power with which he has crowned thee, and I beg thee to obtain for me from God the graces I ask through your intercession. We found this little chaplet in this booklet about chaplets, called My Treasury of Chaplets. It has all of those prayers in there and a photograph of theirs that they made. We tried to copy that. Our centerpiece is a little bit different, but it's the same metal. The white beads are glass covered, or I'm not sure, they might be plastic, but they're little pearls. These are 8mm. This is something I already had, and it goes well with the beginning. And then the center, the wire, the pins, and the chain are all nickel over brass, silver colored, silver tone with a nickel. This is an oxidized metal, and it has Sacred Heart of Jesus on the back, Philomena on the front.
If you can.
Hmm?
Zoom. I was just saying, zoom in so they can see the. There you go.
So here's your finished product. Now I have all the components today to show you how it's put together. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about our little saint. We're going to begin our story with the catacombs, because that is where they found her precious little remains. So I'm going to read to you a story about her nickname is, the Wonder Worker. I have a book about her. And you zoom on this. Saint Philomena, the Wonder Worker. This priest wrote quite a number of wonderful little books for everybody. And this is one of the ones he wrote. And it's a compilation not only of the story, but of all the wonderful miracles that occurred. So we're going to begin with the catacombs. Who has not heard of the catacombs of Rome? Those wonderful hidden passages and corridors. Those subterranean chambers dug out of the bowels of the earth and forming, as it were, a belt of underground fortresses. Here's our first bend in our, it looks like a question mark, and it's a pin that we've bent back so we can make a chain connection. I'm going to put a piece of chain on now. We're starting right here at the top, our first bead of the 13 red beads. I'm going to close it up. And we're going to cut it. We got 3 links, and we're going to cut number 4. And we're going to do that all the way around between each of those beads. On this one, this is the first one. So I'm going to bend that pin back and put chain on. Because that's where we're going to connect to our centerpiece. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so this is this right here. That's our first one. All right, so now we're going to put our second one, and we're going to do that 13 times. Linking all the way around. All right. It's going to take a little while to do this. I'm going to go ahead and read a little bit more of our book. After St. Peter's Basilica and a visit to the Holy Father, the catacombs with their hallowed memories are the great sight of Rome. Here, venerable pontiffs, saintly bishops, spotless virgins, fearless martyrs gathered together in secret to celebrate the divine mysteries. Here, too, tender youths and venerable old men, proud patricians and humble plebeians, nay, princes even, and slaves, knelt at the same altar, adored the same God, and participated in the same divine food. Here we met in the evening at the feet of the venerable pontiff. A few short hours later, they were fighting with lions in the arena. And when the darkness of the night again overshadowed the earth, their mangled remains were borne back for the last benediction to the vicar, Christ vicar on earth. Then they were reverently enclosed in crypts, hollowed out in the tufa, or soft stone, where side by side the living dwelt with the dead. These resting after their labors, those awaiting their summons to the battlefield. The word catacomb is not, the true meaning is not evident at the first sight. It would seem to mean a depression or hollow in the ground. And we find that it applied for the first time to a neighborhood in the Appian Way, close by the tomb of St. Cecilia, under which lay the cemetery of St. Sebastian, those early martyrs. The name catacomb, given to this cemetery, was then gradually applied to the others around Rome. The word thus came to mean a subterranean burial place.
We don't have much traffic today.
It's pretty quiet, huh?
Yeah.
You're missing out on a great story. But it's Monday evening, so a lot of things go on Monday evening. It's been a full day at work, and time for people to take a break. Weary people are probably relaxing or eating their supper.
Indeed.
James, do you want to read a little bit while I keep working on this?
Sure.
Why don't you come sit beside me? I need to focus on this so I don't mess up. But this is a fascinating little story, a true story. Tell us about the origin of the catacombs.
The origin of the catacombs has now been thoroughly investigated. For many years, it was commonly believed that they had been sand pits from which, as the sand was extracted for building, long passages and corridors were formed, which in the early ages of Christianity the faithful used as places of refuge. This opinion is no longer tenable. The great number of catacombs are not dug out in the sandy soil, but are actually hollowed out in the strata of soft stone that's commonly found about Rome. Moreover, sand pits must of a necessity have been near the surface of the earth, and they must have been fashioned that the sand could be easily removed from them. The catacombs, on the other hand, are sunk deep in the earth, 30, 40, or even 50 feet below the surface, and are reached by a steep stairway. They consist of long, narrow passages and corridors opening out into crypts and chambers. The passages intersect each other at different angles. The corridors are formed to present a perfect labyrinth of ways and byways that shoot off for long distances and then branch off again into a new maze of streets and cross streets. At intervals, the shafts go down from the first set of chambers deeper into the ground and then open into new and lower galleries and again from these into lower depths, so that 2, 3, and even more tiers of passages and chambers lie one under the other, and they form a very extensive underground city. It is not conceivable that these should have originally served as sand pits, as it would have been well nigh impossible to extract sand from them in the large quantities required by the Romans. The truth is that an entrance to the catacombs was sometimes made through one of these sand pits to avoid being detected and to cover the retreat of those who entered. It is also possible that the sand pits might have, in the very first days of persecution, furnished hiding places for the Christians before they had time to prepare a refuge for themselves, as they did afterwards. The catacombs, therefore, as we know them, were bored in the soft stone by the early Christians as places of burial for the dead and for living as places of refuge in time of persecution. They served admirably for these purposes, and the entrance was carefully concealed. In order to serve admirably, the entrance was carefully concealed. If this were discovered, or its position was known by some traitor, the approach of an enemy was speedily discovered and frustrated by the faithful, who fled at the first alarm into the more hidden recesses, where pursuit was out of the question. For it needed not only a perfect knowledge of the corridors, but the greatest circumspection to avoid being lost in the bewildering network of the dark passages which resembled each other so closely. Moreover, the corridors were so narrow that an excavator could in a few minutes throw up a barrier of sand and block them up effectively, thus rendering a chase absolutely impossible. Interesting that it uses the word excavator. I guess they mean a person who dug and excavated some material into the corridor to block. Okay. As a final resource, some, at least, of the catacombs were joined one with another by secret passages through which the fugitives could escape in an extreme necessity. The pagans usually cremated their dead. This custom seems to have been abhorrent at all times to the Christians. Like the Jews, they preferred to bury their dead according to the custom prevalent in Palestine, that is, in vaults cut out of the rock, such as we read regarding the burial place of Lazarus. The sepulchre which Joseph of Arimathea seated for the burial of our Lord was also hewn out of rock. However, the persecution started in the reign of Nero, 54 to 68 A.D., and the Christians could not safely perform burial in the presence of their heathen enemies above ground, so from a very early date they must have begun to hollow out these subterranean cemeteries. We have proofs of the existence of the catacombs as early as the reign of Domitian, A.D. 96. It is not easy to divine where the Christians who died in Rome before this date were buried. No traces of such burial places are to be found, but it is surmised that they were buried either in the Jewish cemetery, less abhorrent to them than pagan burial grounds, or that Roman converts who had private mausoleums allowed their new brethren to have a resting place in the immediate proximity of their own. The catacombs are enormous in extent, and it is calculated that if instead of being grouped around Rome they were stretched out in one direction, they should reach a length of several hundred miles. Grave authorities tell us that 6 million Christians are buried in the catacombs. The number is not excessive if we calculate that these cemeteries were in use upwards of 300 years, and that in these 300 years 10 bloody persecutions were waged against the helpless Christians. Though the 60 catacombs in the vicinity of Rome are the most famous, there are others scattered over different parts of Italy, France, Greece, Illyria, Africa, and Asia Minor, all of which possess many notable archaeological treasures. The catacombs were naturally abandoned when Constantine gave lasting peace to the Catholic Church. Hiding places were no longer required, and there was no further need for subterranean burial. They were venerated, however, and most justly so, as places of pilgrimage, for they were the hallowed resting places of the heroes and heroines whose names were in every mouth and whose memories were revered, whose combats and triumphs were the glory and consolation of the Church, and whose help was invoked in every need. Thus they continued until Rome fell prey to the Goths and Lombards. These barbarous invaders, believing that vast treasures were hidden in the underground vaults, invaded the sacred precincts, broke open the tombs of the martyrs, and scattered their dust on the ground. The next phase in the history of the catacombs was marked by the transference of the relics of the more famous martyrs to the great basilicas and other sanctuaries especially erected for them by Roman patricians. The popes, seeking to depose these precious, the popes desirous of depositing these precious remains in places more worthy of them and anxious to put before the eyes of the people the examples of those heroes and heroines of the faith, proceeded to transfer thousands of the bodies, and they're not certain exactly how many thousands, of the bodies to above-ground churches where they would be more accessible to the veneration of the faithful.
Okay, I've got the 13 complete. Now I'm going to do these 3 white ones right here. And they take a little bit larger pin because the bead is a 8 millimeter, whereas those were a 6 millimeter. The same concept. I'm going to put chain between them. A little bit smaller tool.
Okay, so Saint Philomena was found in a catacomb.
Yes, she was.
So that's coming up. The catacombs became less frequented and were entirely abandoned after a time. Dirt and debris blocked the interest that all knowledge of their whereabouts was lost, and it was only in the year 1578 that they were casually rediscovered. The Roman pontiffs now became thoroughly alive to the importance of guarding them and appointed trustworthy custodians who could watch over the treasures still remaining in them. The present procedure is as follows. Expert workmen directed by learned ecclesiastics are appointed to make excavations. When a new discovery is made, work ceases until a competent authority arrives, and then a minute examination commences under the direction of specialists. Everything on the exterior of the sarcophagus is first carefully noted, after which it is opened for examination of what may be found inside. Satisfied that they are in the presence of the relics of a holy martyr, those present fall on their knees and recite the prescribed prayers. Then follows diligent investigation, and every sign or emblem discovered is described in writing for the better elucidation of the history of the martyr. Chapter 2. The finding of the body of St. Philomena. It was on May 24th, 1802 that the excavators came on a localus that had never been violated. I guess that's a tomb, I guess. Everything pointed to the fact that the chamber was exactly as it had been when the precious remains were enclosed there long centuries before. The discovery was looked upon from the first as something remarkable, and the opening of the sarcophagus was marked for the very next day, May 25th. On arriving at the spot, the learned custodian noted that the vault was walled up with 3 terracotta slabs on which were depicted in red the symbols of martyrdom. They bore the following description. Lumina-Pax space te cum fi, or cum space fi. It would seem that the slabs had been misplaced, as happens so often in the necessary haste at burial. The first slab should have been placed in the 3rd place, and when this is done, the description becomes at once clear. Pax te cum fi lumina, or peace be with you, Philomena.
Now we're going to connect this to this. So we're going to use this wire here. I don't like to use jump rings because jump rings can come apart. They can be separated. So we're going to use wire instead. I'm going to take 2 pieces, and I want them to be of the same size. So I'm I'm going to turn them at the same time, creating a bend similar to the letter R.
Yeah.
I'm going to cut off a part of it so it's not quite so long. It's a little shorter. Insert the wire through the eye of the piece. Press it down. Put my pliers about at the end of it, and then turn it over.
Back it off.
Now we're going to insert our chain. Once the chain's on, we can close it and go around, creating a knot. And cut off the excess. Press down that little end. Sometimes I cut it a little close and I have to work at it to get it smooth. So I press with my pliers and get it smooth. Now we're going to connect the other end right there, doing the same connection.
Okay.
So they found her
Yeah.
crypt, and
Yeah.
we figured out her name.
Yes. The localus or tomb is considered an excellent specimen of its kind and is rendered exceedingly valuable by the inscription on it of the very name of the martyr whose remains were therein enclosed, a fact of rare occurrence. In addition to this, there were various emblems which were painted on the slabs. First, there was an anchor which, from its resemblance to the cross, was looked on as an emblem of hope. It is also at times a sign of martyrdom, as anchors were fastened to the neck of some of the confessors when they were thrown into the sea. Some think that she was cast in the river Tiber. Second were two arrows, one pointing up and one pointing down. These two might betoken the kind of death which the martyrs suffered, as some were shot to death with arrows. Third, there was a lance, which might have had similar significance. Fourth, a palm, which was an emblem of the martyr's triumph. Fifth and last was a lily, an emblem of purity. Upon the opening of the tomb, the relics of a virgin martyr were found, with a glass vase containing a portion of her blood in dried form. The dried blood found in the vials close to the martyr's resting places have been subjected at various times to test and proven to be indeed blood. In the case of the blood of St. Philomena, we have a far higher guarantee of its genuineness than any given by such process. The wonders wrought daily in and by this precious relic, and witnessed by countless pilgrims, as well as by keen ecclesiastical experts, furnish us with a supernatural proof of the authenticity of the relic. The bones, ashes, and the blood of the saint were carefully placed in a wooden case, which was closed and sealed in 3 locations. This was borne above ground, where it was again opened and examined by experts, among whom were doctors, surgeons, and theologians. The skull...
We're going to put the metal on now, James. So I made me another R. I'll slip it through the eye of the metal. We're doing the same concept. We're going to make our little loops so we can put our chain on. and go around, make our knot. We don't want this to come off. Close it down. Now we're here. All done.
All right.
Let me finish your story.
Well, that's fine. I can finish.
You can finish it? Okay.
The skull was found to have been fractured. The bones were apparently those of a girl, and the doctors surmised she was 12 or 13 years old. Little is known historically of our saint prior to her glorious martyrdom. Her real history commences when her blessed remains were found in the May of 1802 after having rested in the obscurity of the catacomb of St. Priscilla for upwards of 1700 years.
She was found in what year?
1802.
Wow, she was there a long time before they found her. Even those that raided the tombs didn't find her.
Indeed.
She's been hidden pretty good.
Yes. After the final examination of the relics, a document was made out and placed in the case containing the remains. This was once more closed and sealed and deposited in the chapel or treasury where the bodies of saints and martyrs are kept, awaiting the Holy Father's orders for bestowal on some church. 3 years later, namely in 1805, the Bishop of Potenza arrived in Rome, accompanied by a humble priest from Magnano del Cardinal, a village not far from Naples in the Diocese of Nola. During his stay in the Eternal City, this good priest, Don Francisco de Lucia, did all in his power to achieve the great ambition of his life, which was to secure the body of some virgin martyr for his church. To this end, he obtained permission to visit the treasury of relics, where at first he was perfectly unmoved. As he approached, however, the spot where the relics of Saint Philomena were deposited, an indescribable emotion took possession of him. He felt all at once a burning desire to obtain these precious remains. Insurmountable difficulties arose. It was against the custom to bestow such treasures on a simple priest. His petition was absolutely and irrevocably refused. An intimate friend of his, seeing his distress, succeeded by personal influence in getting for him the body of another saint, which he reluctantly accepted in lieu of what he had craved for. During the negotiations for the relics, Don Francisco was consumed with fever, lost all appetite, and fell seriously ill. The Bishop of Potenza became seriously alarmed for his life. One evening, while the good priest was brooding over his disappointment, a sudden inspiration came over him. He promised to take St. Philomena as his special patron and to take her to Magnano if only he could get possession of her relics. He was instantaneously cured. Both he and the bishop were convinced that the cure was a miracle of the saint. Afterwards, the apparently insuperable difficulties were removed, and Don Francisco became the happy possessor of the ashes, the bones, and the blood of St. Philomena. From this moment forward began an uninterrupted series of miracles and wonders, the like of which have been rarely or perhaps never seen in the history of the Church. The sick were healed, the dying restored to health, sinners were converted, and evil-minded men were punished. Prodigies the most extraordinary, graces the most abundant, blessings the most copious, were the daily fruits of the little saint's intercession. The bishop and Don Francisco, deeply grateful for the latter's wonderful cure, promised to take the holy relics in their own carriage and give them the place of honor. The day of departure arrived. The bustle and fuss of preparation drove the promise out of the heads of the travelers. One thing, however, they made perfectly sure of, and that was that all the relics were safe. They are placed under the seat occupied by the bishop and securely fastened. Scarcely, however, had his lordship taken his place in the carriage when he felt sharp blows on his legs. He was forced to get out and gave orders to the coachman to fasten the box more securely. It was, however, perfectly clear to all present that the case was as secure as it could be. Nothing could displace it. Very much surprised, his lordship resumed his seat, but the blows came again so violent that he was once more forced to relinquish his place and leave the carriage. This gave occasion to new discussions and further examination. All now saw for themselves that the case was so well fastened that even the violent jolt of the carriage could have moved it. Yet it had not moved. Yet the carriage had not moved a single pace. For the third time the bishop took his seat, but in vain. Again he was smitten sharply on the legs, and so severely hurt that he beat a hasty retreat, declaring that on no condition would he travel with the box where it was. Rather, he said, I shall take it in my arms all the way. It was removed and given the place of honor in front of the carriage, whereupon all trouble ceased and the journey was begun. Only now did our travelers recollect their promise, and at once recognized in the unacceptable and unaccountable blows the wish of the saint that her rights should be respected. Full of reverence and awe, these holy men took off their hats, and, with cheeks bedewed with tears, tenderly and repeatedly kissed the blessed relics. The rest of the journey to Naples was happily made. Our travelers lodged in the house of a good friend, where the relics were encased in a statue of the saint specially made for the purpose, and this in turn was placed in a casket of precious wood. The lady of the house, who was suffering from an incurable disease of long standing, proceeded with the help of others to rub the statue in precious garments. While they were thus engaged, the face of the statue was seen to undergo repeated change of expression, and the relics exhaled a most delightful perfume. Before leaving the family, which had given her such a warm reception, St. Philomena restored a perfect health to the good lady of the house, to the greatest joy of her friends, who had entertained the gravest fears for her life. And then it proceeds onward from Naples to Mignano, and then the marvels of Mignano. It recounts various people who were healed, and the great miracle of Mignano. And it continues. This book is over 150 pages. This book is Saint Philomena, the Wonder Worker, by Father Paulo Sullivan. And I don't believe we have this in our store, actually.
No, we do not. That's the only copy I have.
Okay, so it is what time? I have the clock, but it's white. And okay, it's 7:37. Okay, we can continue to read if you like to read.
I'll read a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, it starts there.
Okay, so they're on their way to Mugnano. Various prodigies occurred during the short journey, which was made on foot and during the night. Finding the darkness too intense to proceed, the bearers of the casket called on the blessed martyr for help. Immediately a small break in the clouds allowed the light of the moon to fall on the road along the little procession, which was thus enabled to proceed with perfect safety. Later on, as the procession was passing Cimitel, I guess that's a city, the relics became unaccountably heavy, causing the bearers great difficulty in carrying them. Cimitel in olden days had been the scene of countless martyrdoms, and the saint wished, it would seem, to tarry a little near the glorious battlefield, bathed by the blood of her fellow martyrs. The whole neighborhood was at this time suffering from drought, and the cry arose from the multitudes that came flocking from all parts to welcome the saint. If she really wishes to show her power, let her get us the rain we so much need, they declared. Almost immediately, torrents of rain poured down, to the delight of the peasant folk, who saw in the fact a manifest answer to their prayer. Still more striking was another prodigy. The group of travelers bearing the relics arrived in Mugnano as the dawn was breaking over the hills. The roads were now thronged with crowds, gathered together from all the neighborhood. It was necessary to pause while the enormous throng was being mustered for the procession. At this moment, a mighty whirlwind arose and came sweeping over the hillside. So appalling was this tempest that the people were terror-stricken. The cry arose on all sides, "God and St. Philomena, save us!" One of the priests, addressing the frightened people, bade them fear nothing, for the storm was stirred by the demons, who recognized in St. Philomena the same dauntless virgin who had so confounded them 17 centuries before, and who was now coming again to put them to shame and snatch from them their victims. Still the wind shrieked and whistled in the most alarming way, approaching rapidly the spot where the relics were resting. Here it suddenly stopped, as if held at bay by an invisible power, and instead of sweeping past, as one would naturally have supposed, and mounted into the air, and it disappeared. Again and again it recommenced with relentless fury until during the procession, but was powerless to do the slightest harm to the people. All were amazed at its manifest importance, for it failed to extinguish a single one of the lights that were borne by the side of the relics. For 2 whole days this weird wind howled on the neighboring hills. Satan foresaw the graces that were to be so plentifully showered on this favored neighborhood, and he vented his rage in a vain display of baffled hate and fury. A great change soon became visible in Magnano. Blessings were granted in rich abundance. Miracles of all kinds showed the wondrous power of the saint. The faith of the people grew in intensity, and the sanctuary soon became known far and wide by reason of the marvelous favors accorded to the pilgrims who flocked to the feet of the little saint. Chapter 3. The Marvels of Magnano. The night before the arrival of the relics at Magnano, a poor man who had been compelled to remain in bed for several months, absolutely unable to work, hearing of the arrival of the remains of the holy martyr on the morrow, prayed fervently to the saint during the night, begging that he might at least be able to see and kiss the precious relic. The saint seemed deaf to his prayer, for the pains, far from lessening, became more intense. When, however, the bells announced the arrival of the sacred treasure, he dragged himself from bed, in spite of his sufferings, and made heroic efforts to go and meet the procession. Upon leaving his house, he was perfectly cured. For 9 days the crowds flocked unceasingly to the church to venerate the relics, the 9th day being marked by notable miracles. One of these was a poor widow who besought the saint during Mass to cure her crippled boy, who was unable to stand. At the elevation during the Mass of the Sacred Host, the boy jumped up from where he was, and he ran to the urn of the saint's relics to thank her for the cure. At the conclusion of the Mass, the child walked about the town, to the delight of the admiring throngs, who rang bells and beat drums, and finally, seizing the boy, bore him up upon their arms for a procession throughout the streets. The report of this miracle brought still greater crowds to the afternoon devotions. A poor mother dipped her fingers in the oil of the saint's lamp, and anointed the eyes of her little child, who had lost his sight from smallpox, and whom the doctors declared incurable. The moment the mother anointed the lids, the child recovered his sight. There was...
So this was in 1805, I believe?
Yes, I believe so.
Yes.
After her exhumation,
Yeah.
I believe 1802
1802.
was
Okay.
when they excavated
Oh, okay. So
the remains.
transporting her.
They transported her now. In 1805, the bishop...
Yes, the bishop was able to secure
Yes.
her from basically storage.
Yes.
Okay.
And there are many more miracles. And one of her greatest followers was a well-known saint, Saint Vincent de Paul.
Really?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
They call him the Cure of Ars. He and Pauline Jaricot, which was I guess, a friend and cohort of his. Well, she told him about the little saint, and he had a special devotion to her. Many people have, throughout at this time, named their children Philomena. It was a pretty popular name. I have a friend who was named after her. Actually, that would have been her confirmation saint name. So.
Okay. What time is it?
Our time has ended here tonight. So you can go to our page, our little store, and find these little chaplets there with the card. And there's more on the back side about how to say the chaplet, the prayers that go with the chaplet.
All right.
So I guess we'll say good evening.
All right. Yes. Let me check to make sure there are no questions.
Okay.
Okay. There are no questions, so I think we can proceed. All right.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Good night, everyone.